I'm going to talk a little bit about Ryan Faulk and the collapse of the alt-right. Recently, Ryan Faulk made a video that was about 25% him renouncing white nationalism. Not really renouncing it, but rejecting it, saying this is not the right ideology. This is not, I don't think he was very clear on it. He has since taken that video down and put up a new video on YouTube at least. So, his views might be more clearly expressed in the new video, but I haven't watched it yet, and I want to comment on the original video anyway. So I'll just comment on it before I watch the next video, which I think is just a more, probably a more coherent and well thought out explanation of why Ryan has rejected white nationalism. Now, as probably most of you know, I have never been a white nationalist. I have never attached that label to myself or the alt-right label to myself. And I think race is real, race matters, but race is not everything. It is not the crux of my worldview. And I think it is a mistake to make it into the crux of your worldview. Not everything revolves around race. That's a message I have put out there more than once. In fact, if you go back to 2014, I believe it was, I made a reply video to Ryan Faulk, back when he was Fringe Elements, I think. I think he was still calling himself Fringe Elements. And I replied to one of his videos, and I basically said that white nationalism was, well, first of all, it was not necessary, it was not sufficient, and it didn't really make sense. And in particular, I said it is not the, natural or default ideology or the default basis of society. Of course, he didn't listen to me. He did not respond to that video. I'm not really surprised. People like Ryan almost never address their critics unless they think they have something to gain by addressing them. I don't know if that's a conscious choice or a subconscious choice. I don't know if he just subconsciously dismisses critics that challenge the fundamental assumptions of his worldview in a way that he has no response to, or if he just consciously selects people based on whether or not they will help advance his message. It's probably a little bit of both. You'll notice he invested a lot of time responding to Crowd and T, right? And he has spent a lot of time responding to other people who were arguing with him about race realism. And I think the reason why is that Ryan knows he can win that argument. Because race is real. There are genetic differences between different subpopulations of humanity. There has been somewhat divergent evolution. It probably affects mental abilities and preferences, not just physical abilities and appearance. So that's race realism in a nutshell. And I agree with that, and in fact, in some ways, I might be more of a genetic determinist than Ryan, but I'm not going to get into that. I guess what matters here is that our views would be very similar, let's put it that way. We might not entirely agree on everything, but our views would be very similar. However, where in the past we strongly disagreed was probably in the conception of race itself. I think Ryan conceptualized race as a society, as your tribe, as your in-group. And for that reason, he viewed racial nationalism as the natural state and your race as your natural social identity. And that is basically what most white nationalists believe, that society is based on genetic altruism, like kin altruism or something like that. And maybe even that your race is like a superorganism, and you are just a cell in the body. You are just a part of this larger thing that is your race, and your race is actually like an organism, and what matters is the survival and perpetuation of your race. It is not really the individual that matters, not even really you that matters to you. It is your race that should matter to you. Well, that belief has empirical content. And I would say that it is completely falsified by the evidence that we have available to us. We can clearly see that people do not act for the good of their race, and that humans do not act, individuals are individually selfish. Parents care about their children. People do not really care about their race or even ethnic group that much. They do to some extent because people have this mechanism called a social identity, this thing in your brain that allows you to identify with a group. But that thing is not necessarily linked to race. That is one way that people can be divided up conceptually, and that is one, it could be a component of your social identity, and in fact it probably is, especially in a modern society. But of course, if you go back 1,000 years, it would not have had anything to do with your social identity, because you would not have ever met anyone of another race. So the concept of race would not have existed in your mind. You would have identified with some group that was much smaller than a race. And for all of human history, people have been organized into smaller groups that fought one another. People have never been organized at the level of races. Races have never been societies, and conflict, although it may have often been, like in recent history, it may have been between people of different races, it often wasn't. Like World War I and World War II were fought between whites, mostly. Anyway, the confusion between race and society is really the fundamental metaphorical confusion of white nationalism. So I'm not saying that race is irrelevant to society, but I am saying that race is not the basis of society. Society is not the same as race. Race is not the same as society. Society is a power structure of individuals organized together into a cooperative unit, a unit that can act in the world. And a race is a category of individuals. Those are completely different things, and confusing them is a source of error. And I think that is the root cause of the errors of white nationalism, that it has this idealistic conception of race as your natural tribe or natural in-group. And not only does that not fit the evidence that we have available, it also doesn't make a very good basis for a society. Because society has to be based on more than just some tiny additional number of genes that are shared on average more by members of a population. Right? And another thing I will say about race is that it's a very blunt instrument for analyzing genetic variation. And I think that's something that Ryan has discovered for himself over the years. He could have listened to me, but of course he chose not to. He chose to go down that road himself, because, when you ignore your critics, you often learn things the hard way. So it took him 4 years to learn that, but I think he has sort of discovered that by researching the causes of the European Revolution, as he calls it, European exceptionalism, the explosion of, basically modernity, right? The explosion of creativity, basically the expansion of economic and technological complexity that happened in Europe, especially in northwestern Europe, over the last 500 years and spread around the world. Okay, that thing that goes by various names. I like Ryan's term, the European Revolution. I think that's a great term for it. Whatever you want to call it, it did come from Europe. It probably had something to do with genes. And so it did have something to do with race, but it's not that simple. Okay, and one of the things I think Ryan has been looking into, he's been looking into the work of Gregory Clark, who said basically that there has been recent selection in European populations, especially in northwestern Europe, for people who are, less violent, more law-abiding, and have better abstract reasoning ability. Or you could just say IQ. Now, I don't think that's the whole explanation for the European Revolution. I think that's one component. I think another component is more racial, in a sense, and it goes back to the Greeks and Romans, and it goes way back maybe to the Indo-Europeans. And then I think there's another component that is purely circumstantial, that has to do with the economic circumstances of Europe in the last 500 years. But I don't want to get into my theories on that. My point is that Ryan, I think, has discovered that the story involves genes, but it isn't a simple one of one race good, other race bad, or one race smart, other race dumb, that it involved recent selection in Europeans, eugenics, basically. So I think a number of reasons accumulated in Ryan's brain over the years, and that was one of them. He developed a more sophisticated understanding of history and of biology, and probably of psychology as well, of human nature. And this more sophisticated understanding does not fit into this simplistic model of racial conflict and ma race is ma in-group. And then I also think there were some other things that happened during that time, and one of those is the failure of the alt-right. So I think a number of things accumulated in his brain, and then he suddenly reached a tipping point and underwent a paradigm shift from white nationalism to a new ideology. Well, this isn't the first time that Ryan has abandoned an ideology after promoting it for years, right? Ryan was an ANCAP, and I listened to one of his old videos once in which he talked about his intellectual development, and I think he said that he had been an evangelical Christian and then a Marxist communist, and then he became an anarcho-capitalist, and then he kind of switched over through race realism into racial nationalism. Now, if you go through one ideology after another like that, you should probably take a step back and ask yourself, why? Why do I keep doing this? Because by his own admission, he has been wrong in a major way more than once, right? And he has led others along with him, or maybe he hasn't really led them, maybe he has more crowd surfed in front of them. That's an interesting question. To what extent did Ryan lead people down this path, and to what extent did he simply surf the crowd? I tend to think most of these apparent thought leaders are really crowd surfers. They sort of get out ahead of the crowd, and they appear to be leading it, but really it's the momentum of the crowd that is pushing them forward. And I think partly that's one of the explanations for Ryan's change of heart and mind, is that the alt-right wave appears to have crested and it's sort of subsiding, right? So I think he's, whether he's conscious of this or not, he is kind of getting off a dying wave. And that might be good pragmatically for him, Now, I think Ryan did a lot of good in promoting race realism, but I also think he did a lot of harm to the developing intellectual right in general, this sort of intellectual or dissident right space, because really the only intellectual space that's allowed to be right-wing is a dissident one at this point in history. And I think he did some harm to it by attaching race realism to racial nationalism, which he now rejects, right? He is not rejecting race realism, he is rejecting racial nationalism. And so to do that, he must decouple those things. Which, again, to blow my own horn, I have always decoupled, and I have always made the effort to decouple, and I've been preaching that mostly to deaf ears, while Ryan is merely surfing ahead on the wave of popularity. And I'm not saying this out of sour grapes, I'm just pointing this out. This is how these things work. The truth often loses out to simpler and more emotionally compelling ideas. And for the last couple of years, white nationalism has been a very emotionally compelling idea for a lot of people. because it has clear links to problems in the West. And it gives people fairly simple answers to those problems, and a very simple dichotomy that they can focus on, and a clear enemy. It's very nice and simple in that way. It divides the world up into us versus them, good versus evil, and, it gives people a Walt Disney narrative, and that's why it was popular. And the same thing goes for anarcho-capitalism. That was popular for the same kind of reason. It gave people that simple view of the world. The state is bad, statists are evil, freedom is good, blah, blah, blah. Very simplistic, naive view of the world. So Ryan has been promoting a simplistic and naive view of the world, even though he has been doing good work when it is confined to race realism. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the Richard Spencer thing, because half of Ryan's video was, or more than half of it actually, was a rant about Richard Spencer. He was just attacking Richard Spencer for fucking everything up, for turning the alt-right into a dumpster fire. And while I would agree that Richard Spencer made a lot of mistakes and has also caused a lot of damage to the intellectual right, I think starting around the Hailgate speech, that's when Richard Spencer became a liability. I think up until that point, he was actually not a liability. He was a bit of a moderate voice among certain circles that were actually more extreme. Then Hailgate came along, and I think because of hubris in the wake of the Trump victory, there was this kind of premature triumphalism among many people in the alt-right and right-wing circles in general, and that made them do stupid things because they got carried away. They thought they were winning, and now is the time to get more extreme. When in fact, when you win, that's the time to actually consolidate your position and to entrench. They were just prematurely triumphant. They thought they had won the war when they had only won a very small battle in the war, to use that metaphor. So there were a lot of things that the alt-right did wrong, that Richard Spencer did wrong, but there were also things that Ryan Faulk did wrong. And of those, the biggest one was connecting race realism to racial nationalism and pushing this false conception of race as your in-group, as your society, as the natural social identity for Homo sapiens. Okay, so that was Ryan's contribution to the dumpster fire of the alt-right. He criticizes Richard Spencer for doing meat space events, and of course Charlottesville is the most notoriously stupid event. And I agree that was a very stupid event. But I think that event itself was not really where the alt-right went wrong. I'm not really disagreeing with Ryan's criticisms of Richard Spencer. I probably agree with 90% of them. But where I disagree is focusing all of the blame on Richard Spencer and not accepting any for himself, which I think Ryan should have done, because he helped to, he was kind of a rabble-rouser. He participated in this rabble-rousing. He participated in this attitude of let's just push our ideas using propaganda. Let's not listen to critics. And if we even listen to them at all, let's do it only when we can make propaganda out of it. So let's only listen to Crowd and Tea. Let's ignore everyone who is making more difficult challenges. He helped to create this movement, this ideological movement. He helped to create this ideology, this overconfidence in certain beliefs, and this emotionality about them that eventually is going to lead to things like Charlottesville. If you rouse the rabble, they will act like rabble. If you give the rabble something to rally around and you give them some simplistic view of the world and tell them to go out there and fight for it, they will do that. At least some of them will. And maybe Ryan Faulk has outgrown that sort of thing. He has grown up a bit. He has learned a few things, and that's great. But he was part of creating that thing. He was part of organizing those people into this mass that turned into a fucking dumpster fire. You know? He poured some gasoline on the garbage too. He heaped up some of the garbage too. Right? It wasn't just Richard Spencer piling garbage in the dumpster and throwing gasoline on it and playing with matches. It was TRS, it was Ryan Faulk, it was all of those guys. So, I really think Ryan should eat a bit of humble pie, and I don't expect he will do that. I don't expect he will take a step back and say to himself, I should really think more before I adopt a new paradigm. Maybe I shouldn't just adopt a new ideology right away. Maybe I should reflect on why I was wrong over and over. Why was I wrong about all these things in the past? How did I fuck things up so badly? How did I deceive myself so badly? He should do that, but I don't think he will do that. However, First Worldism does sound much closer to my beliefs, and it might have a better chance of success. I guess that's the other thing I forgot to mention. Ryan recognized eventually that white nationalism had no chance of succeeding politically, so it just wasn't pragmatic. But he also said that he was really emotionally attached to the idea of his people. But then he came to see that they didn't view him as one of theirs, you know? This was a fiction. This was an illusion, a fantasy, not reality. All right, anyway, I need to go do something, so I'll end it there. Thanks for listening.